I have young people, artists come to me, or not only young, but all ages, and they'll say, well, I used to paint realistically, but I got to the bottom of it, and that's why I turned to abstraction. And I often think to myself, yes, they got to the bottom of their own depth of character, but not to the subject.
Andrew Wyeth has been painting for over 50 years, but he works in only two places, here in Maine, this is his summer home, and in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, where he was born. His pictures are amongst the most popular in America and command some of the highest prices, and yet the people and places he chooses to paint are usually deeply personal. Her room is his wife Betsy's sitting room, and the painting grew out of Wyeth's anxiety about his son making a solo boat trip upriver. It was painted 17 years ago, and yet one of Wyeth's latest paintings is set in the next-door room. The Wyeths use it as a dining room, but it's an old schoolhouse which they moved from another part of Maine. It's a sparsely furnished room, but full of textures. The painting is realistic in tone, but it manages to convey many Wyeth obsessions. There's a strong suggestion of people, although there are none in the painting, and a sense of mystery and even witchcraft. It's called Witching Hour. In its restraint and understatement, it's typical of many of Wyeth's greatest works.
Everything that I've painted were places where I had experiences, and I'm strongly about the personal element of what I paint. I think that's really the whole quality of my work, to go deeper into something that I know intimately throughout my whole life and try to pull it out. My father came here in 1903 to study under the illustrator Howard Pyle, and he fell in love with this country. And of course I was born here. Pyle had a class of about 12 students. My father was one of them. And they call it the Brandywine School. It's actually the Howard Pyle School, really. It was an illustrator's haven here. My father did the classics, Stevenson and James Fenimore Cooper. And that's very a remarkable father in that he believed that he knew I was going to be a painter or an artist or an illustrator. He wasn't certain, but he often said, it's so important for a child that is going to be creative to have a life alone. That's why he was against college education for a painter. After all, you gain all your experience you may spend the rest of your life on between the age of, say, 6 and 18. And I certainly did. Still to this day with me, Christmas has a strange aura. For instance, our stockings, which we hung on the end of the post of our beds, we were made to go to bed early, my brothers and sisters, and it was a terrifying experience because old Chris, as we called him, St. Nicholas, was to me a terrifying man. He was a big man. I saw him several times, which was my father dressed up. And I remember when I was about 8 years old, 7 years old, lying in bed, I couldn't get to sleep. And all of a sudden I heard footsteps on the stairs, and this figure came in white fur with little lights blinking on and off. And I could hear it, and I crawled under the covers, and I could hear him filling the stocking. And there was sort of bells as he walked down the stairs. And I was terrified, to the point that I wet the bed. This, to me, this is a type of thing that he did. And I remember one year this was about a week before Christmas, we were sitting in the living room, us kids playing on the floor. I think I had soldiers out. And we heard stamping of feet on the top of the roof. And down the chimney, through the flue, we have an enormous chimney in the house, came this amazing painting of the head of Santa. Well, my father almost fell off the roof, almost killed himself that day. Because he's a big man. He weighed almost 300 pounds, my father did. He had gone up there. I just tell you that story, how he believed in exciting our imaginations. My other brothers and sisters were off at school or studying art, and I was left alone, although I had tutors in the morning, and the rest of the day I was free. This is before I went into the studio under my father. So I wandered these hills and these woods and the brooks and the country and really got to know it intimately. I made up my own stories of what was happening around me. These hills became Sherwood Forest, the English countryside, or the battlefields of France. All these imaginary things floated through my mind. I can look at those soldiers and remember the names of practically every one of them. I much preferred to play with them by myself, make up my own stories. King Vitor's the big parade has had a strong influence on me. It's interesting that the part that impressed me as a child still holds. The scenes of him leaving by truck and going to the front, that French girl trying to find him in the crowd, and the motion of the trucks and the gun carriages going and her figure there. I thought it was very dramatic, leaving her lone figure there against that rather painted background, but interesting what you can do with almost nothing. Long line of trucks, and it was leaving to the front. My interest in Kerners really started as a small boy because of my interest in the First World War, which I was born just as Americans entered the war in 1917. And finding Carl was a machine gunner in the German army. And of course I knew his kids and played with them. But his telling me stories, it fascinated me because there's a strange mood, even though Carl's now gone. Very Germanic. There's a feeling of could be in Austria, the Black Forest, those trees in front, those spruce and pine. He planted them from small examples from the Black Forest, where he was a sheep herder. But he wasn't just a Pennsylvania farmer to me. I mean, I'll be there alone in that house, and all of a sudden a shot will ring out. And it's Carl maybe hunting deer, or maybe he was just target practicing. And you'll go into his house and you'll see these rifles slung on the wall. There's a military feeling. There's something more than just a farm.
Andy, you know, he talked to my father about the First World War, and Andy was so interested in the foreign of the First World War, and my father told him a lot of the things that had happened, you know. My father was on the front lines, and you know, when you're on the front lines, there was no turning back. And it pretty near got fighting so close that they, you know, used hand grenades, and actually they got pretty close there a few days. It was just firing, you know, into the enemy there within maybe 15 to 20 yards. They were getting close. And he says many a time tanks came by, they've tied 2 and 3 hand grenades together and throw it into a track of a tank and blow it up. Blew one track off. One tank went around the circle all afternoon. Yeah.
To be in that house alone, and the marvelous rich smell of sausage cooking permeated the air.
The hooks, well, they're mainly for smoked hams, or farmers make their own sausage. They smoke them in the chimney, and then they hang them there and season them, let the fat dry off of them, and we'd make all kinds of meat, you know.
I felt so strong about the ceilings and the hook, and I worked on that, how I was going to do him. I made drawings of him in profile. I made drawings. I worked on quite a long time, and then one day I realized, oh my God, I must look by his head up to the ceiling. I want to get that feeling that you might even be talking with him. Maybe you're going by him to those hooks, which also to me expressed his rather Germanic power, sharpness. I wanted to get it to the essence of the man. I felt that he was more like a U-boat captain than a farmer with his black collar and that severe, and then those iron hooks. I think it disturbed him a little. He said, why don't you paint me with my snowdrops that he loved? He had a very sentimental side, as most Germans do. He said, that's awfully severe. But this is the way I felt about him, and actually I was right, because he was severe.
It was a courageous picture. That was that picture, and you look at my father. It's he's putting there, and you're looking at him. You think he's alive. It was something.
I learned a lot by that painting. I hadn't done any portraits up to that time, and I lost my father in an accident right near where Kerner's lived. And I regretted so that I hadn't done his portrait. I'd done impressionistic watercolors of him sitting in the rocks and things like that, but not really done him. And Carl reminded me of my father in many ways. Carl was a much more Germanic-looking man and shaved head and that, but they both had that tough quality, Germanic power. And I realized that here was my father still alive. And when you think actually it was my first real portrait.
when the steam train or the milk train went down. He got hit there one day. Yeah, was something that was very sad. But we heard the whistle every day, but that day they said nobody blew the whistle.
I think that it changed me from just painting pictures into painting a reality with an edge, with a meaning. His death really gave me a meaning to paint. It's a strange thing. I knew he meant a great deal to me, and we had a marvelous time together, and he was terrific, not just as a father, but as someone to talk to, you know. And I think having him taken away so quickly and abruptly, it really jolted me. And there's quite a change if you look at my work from then on. Up to that time, I did many watercolors, which are very brilliant in color and flashy, dramatic, and full of a lot of swish. And then, when you look at those, and then all of a sudden look at the portrait of Carl, I think you have to have a reason in a creative painting to doing a thing. And his death gave me a terrific reason. Then I did one called Winter 1946 of a boy running down the hill, which is related to the whole thing. See, I aimed to stay around the location of where he was killed. It took on a strange quality of color to me, mood, which I still retain to this day. And I think that if you look at the paintings of Kerner's of mine, you'll begin to sense that it's not a quaint farm where they work in the garden and they milk their cows. When they slaughter a pig, it's brutal. And I was attracted by this. It's always cool to go in the summertime into a milk shed like that with that constantly running water from that spring up on the hill. And the trickle of that water. There's something awfully brutal about the thing, although it's a charming farm interior. But to me, there's something else there that fascinated me. And then the snow on the distant hills, the cattle out in the courtyard. The sound of those animals' hoofs on that cement to me is the most shattering quality. And these are the qualities that I was after in the thing. You think of harshness, New York City in the nighttime with cars going by or something, but the silence of the city. Well, this is the silence of the country. I thought that's some of the best painting in it, I think, the cup, that almost transparent feeling. You notice the cup is still there, isn't it? I saw the light in the window. Carl was, Kerner Sr. was ill at the time, and that light was on late at night, although I saw this in the early spring evening. I guess it was March, I think it was done in. If you notice, in the watercolor, there's little buds coming out on the trees just before it breaks. And the dampness of the dam with the overflow and a certain rich succulence in the thing that I was after, in that stone white building reflecting the moon coming up as you notice the wall of the house. I've left out some windows because I wanted to bring that feeling of reflected light.
She's one that don't bother anybody, my mother, you know. She's a person that's coming into a new country wasn't that easy, you know. Mother speaking German, couldn't speak English. But she was fortunate. Her brother came over, but still she was homesick to go back. She settled pretty good. She has her good days and bad days too, you know. There's certain days won't let people come in. She's not feeling well. I let her do what she wants. She keeps that barnyard, that's her enjoyment. If I stop her, it would be the worst thing. She would probably go in the house, start to cry, you know. I'll take her work away from her. She cooks pretty good. She knows that's her main chore and learned that from the old country, and she does that very well.
I saw her there, and I made some drawings of her, just little rough sketches, and then I walked up on the hill, walking home, and I sat up there and I began to think of that kitchen way down below in that place. And that's when I began to dream about what I wanted. I wanted you to feel the enclosure of the building and yet the country outside. Carl was off at a farm sale, but there was his place set. It's more of a portrait of Carl than almost than him being there, you know. Knives were very important to him as a man. I mean, cutting up animals, and he always carried a knife with him. And I think there was a fork there, but that didn't interest me. Because I wanted to express this man, this real person. You'll notice my pictures are very strange. It's as if you're almost floating in the air looking on them. Well, that, I think, is caused unconsciously by the fact that I don't work from a location. I make drawings in all directions. I know what perspective is, and I try to keep my perspective fairly true. Fairly true. But it's certainly not accurate perspective. I think I worked on it for about 5 months, that painting. The table wasn't in it in the beginning. There was a dog. His German Shepherd dog was down in the corner. Mrs. Kerner was in it for a while. Great transition, that picture. The log outside of the window with that tooth like the fangs of the dog really became the dog so that I could eliminate the dog. I realized that I was overtelling my story, because there were the sharp teeth of that German Shepherd. And then the sunspot. The day I put that in, hitting on the side of the wall, really did the trick.
We always enjoyed deer hunting every year, going up Pennsylvania mountains, and it kept our eyes, sharpened us up a little bit. He enjoyed it very much. He was a hunter all his life, and being in the First World War, he was a pretty good shot.
I'd worked on his figure in that for, well, actually a year and a half. I kept going back and working on it. And then first I thought, well, I'll put these trophies, because that's the room I did it in. And one day Mrs. Kerner came up, Anna Kerner came up and said, in German, I could understand, she said, "Why didn't you come for dinner? I called you." And she looked at him severely. And he spoke back in very harsh terms. And I thought, oh my God, there it is. That's a whole portrait of their life, with his rifle aiming right toward her, blow her head off. And I'd already painted in a moose head, which was lousy. Didn't work. So I sanded it off, which became part of the wall, as you notice. And she posed for me. I was there at the right moment. Imagine if I hadn't been there. But you see how important it is to be in a surrounding and breathe it, and then it happens, if you're lucky and you're perceptive enough to catch it. I mean, what would Moose's head done in the picture? Nothing.